Hi, I'm Jerry the King Lawler, WWE Hall of Famer Jerry the King Lawler, and you, my friend, are watching another original wrestling documentary.
Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was a professional wrestling promotion based in the Carolinas and Virginia, and was also one of the most influential NWA territories. It began in the early 30s when Jim Crockett Sr. started promoting shows as Eastern States Championship Wrestling until 1973 when his son Jim Crockett Jr. took over and renamed it Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. During the 1980s, Mid-Atlantic merged with many other promotions such as Georgia Championship Wrestling, NWA St. Louis, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and the Universal Wrestling Federation until Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling met a similar fate in 1988 when it became known as World Championship Wrestling, which eventually was bought out by World Wrestling Entertainment in 2001. This is the untold story of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling.
Hi, wrestling fans. Bob Coleman here. Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic
It was 1931. As the United States officially adopted the Star-Spangled Banner for its national anthem, Nevada legalizes gambling, Alka-Seltzer was launched and even had its own radio show called the Alka-Seltzer Comedy Star, the Montreal Canadiens beat the Chicago Blackhawks in Game 5 in the Stanley Cup Finals, Raymond Gunn is tied to the roof of a schoolhouse and burned alive by a mob of 2,000 in Maryville, Missouri after being accused of murdering a teacher with no trial or due process, while the National Guard who was placed there to protect him stood by and did nothing. And Jim Crockett of Charlotte, North Carolina borrowed $50, rented a hall and promoted a match in Bristol, Tennessee, and by 1935 was running 20 cities and even hired 3 publicity men at $100 per week, along with his partner Pete Moore. They also promoted concerts, plays, minor league baseball, and even ice hockey, laying the foundation for what is now called Jim Crockett Promotions. Although the business was always called Jim Crockett Promotions, it used a variety of pseudonyms as brand names for specific TV shows, newspaper and radio ads, and even on tickets themselves. Along with those brand names were generic standbys, Championship Wrestling, and All-Star Wrestling, as well as East Coast Wrestling, and later Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic Championship Sports, Wide World Wrestling, and Worldwide Wrestling. The promotion at this time was named Eastern States Championship Wrestling, centered in the Carolinas and Virginia. Jack Curley, dean of all wrestling promoters in the early 1900s, thought very highly of a motivated 25-year-old Jim Crockett. In the early 1930s, the territory was initially run by George Kazana, but taken over by Jim Crockett and Pete Moore. At the same time, professional wrestling had outgrown its carnival roots, making a way to a host of colorful independent local and regional wrestling promotions. Newspapers were also reporting results alongside amateur wrestling in the sports section. By 1939, Crockett had bought out Pete Moore for $8,000 and became partners with promoter Bill Lewis, who also wrestled as Bluebeard, and was known to send postcards out to regular fans reminding them of the upcoming shows. A dispute arose over the bookings of new wrestling sensation Jim Londos, so New York City promoter Jack Curley negotiated an alliance between various regional managers that enabled Londos to travel the country as champion while allowing the promoters to share profits evenly across the regions. As a result of this arrangement, new wrestling territories emerged all across the U.S. The name of this new conglomerate was called the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA upheld the unspoken pact among regional promoters that each would respect territorial boundaries and limit their promotional efforts accordingly. When, on occasion, one federation would challenge another in its own territory, other NWA affiliates would send in top wrestlers to shore up the besieged promoter's card. Crockett officially joined the National Wrestling Alliance in 1952, and his territory covered Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The name Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling became Jim Crockett Promotions' primary brand name in print, radio, and other advertising. The name was also used for its main television programs. The 1950s was a hotbed for tag teams, as the promotion featured mostly all tag team matches, with several brother tag teams such as George and Bobby Becker, Emil and Ernie Dusek, John and Al Smith, Jack and George Curtis, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, and Sandy and George Scott. Other big names during this era included Rip Hawk, Lord Littlebrook, Bob Orton, Amazing Zuma, Johnny Weaver, Ray Stevens, Pat O'Connor, and Bearcat Wright. By the early 1970s, an ailing Jim Crockett was forced to retire, and his son-in-law John Wrigley had begun to take over many of the territory's responsibilities. Jim Crockett died on April 1, 1973, and control of the company was then ceded to his son, 28-year-old Jim Crockett Jr., who took over the promotion and ultimately renamed it Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Led by the younger Crockett and under the guidance of a new creative force, former wrestler turned matchmaker George Scott, the promotion moved away from generally featuring just tag teams to primarily focusing on singles wrestling, although tag team matches continued to play a big part in the company. Jim Crockett Promotions had gradually phased out its multiple weekly television tapings in such cities as Charlotte, Greenville, and High Point, consolidating its production schedule into just one shoot, a Wednesday night videotaping at WRAL, TV, and Raleigh, and then syndicating the broadcast to several local TV stations throughout the Carolinas and Virginia. In 1981, Jim Crockett Promotions moved to the WPCQ TV studios in Charlotte, a station once owned by Ted Turner. Local shows hosted by announcers like Big Bill Ward from WBTV in Charlotte and Charlie Harville from WGHP in High Point gave way to Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Mid-Atlantic was hosted by Bob Caudle, a longtime WRAL weatherman. Caudle was joined in rotation by a number of co-hosts, everyone from Les Thatcher to Dr. Tom Miller, before David Crockett became Caudle's permanent color commentary man. For a brief period, a secondary show, East Coast Wrestling, was taped at WRAL, which was a repackaged version of Mid-Atlantic and was announced by Big Bill Ward. In 1975, Jim Crockett Promotions premiered a new syndicated B show, Wide World Wrestling, which was renamed Worldwide Wrestling in 1978. The original host of the show was former Georgia Championship Wrestling announcer Ed Capral. Other announcers included Les Thatcher, George and Sandy Scott, and Dr. Tom Miller. It was also hosted by the team of Rich Landrum and Johnny Weaver. In 1978, Jim Crockett Promotions later added a short-lived show, The Best of NWA Wrestling, which was taped at the WCCB studios in Charlotte and featured Johnny Weaver sitting down with top stars in a coach's show format. In 1976, Ric Flair amazingly returned from being injured in a horrible plane crash and quickly became the top heel. He came back as a second to Angelo Mosca in his matches with Wahoo and interfered to help Mosca win some matches. Then Flair made his ring return in Greensboro, North Carolina on January 31, 1976 against Wahoo, defeating him by countout. Over February and March, Flair tore up Wahoo's headdress on TV, and Flair also nearly blinded Wahoo in a match, which set up a feud that did huge business for many months in the territory. During the feud, Flair and Wahoo traded the Mid-Atlantic belt back and forth several times. Wahoo finished 1976 off winning the most popular wrestler of the year. Wahoo suffered a broken ankle on TV courtesy of a step-over grapevine from Greg Valentine. When Valentine did not release the hold on Wahoo immediately, Wahoo began screaming as the hold was put on. Wahoo was out for 8 weeks and was shown on TV many times recuperating. Valentine then started wearing the infamous "I broke Wahoo's leg" t-shirts on TV to end 1977. Wahoo came back in January 1978 for some revenge, and he got it months later when he defeated Valentine for the Mid-Atlantic Championship belt. Wahoo would only hold the belt for 2 months before Ken Patera defeated him for the title. Other top stars of the 70s were the Super Destroyer, Mr. Fuji, The Avenger, Tiger Conway Jr., Brute Bernard, Abe Jacobs, Kevin Sullivan, and Klondike Bill. Jim Crockett Promotions gradually began to expand, running shows in eastern Tennessee, parts of West Virginia, and even Savannah, Georgia. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Jim Crockett Promotions ran regular shows in Cincinnati and even Dayton, Ohio. Crockett and Scott also bought the minority shares of Frank Tunney's Toronto-based promotion Maple Leaf Wrestling. Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling also aired on a Buffalo, New York station, enabling the Tunney Crockett Scott enterprise to bring a full slate of shows to Ontario and upstate New York. In the 1980s, Crockett began consolidating the southern franchises of the National Wrestling Alliance and discarding the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling brand. Jim Crockett began promoting his events simply as the National Wrestling Alliance, although his promotion remained distinct from the larger NWA entity. In August 1980, Jim Crockett was elected president of the NWA. In 1981, former Georgia Championship Wrestling booker Ole Anderson took over as Mid-Atlantic's booker, and in 1981, Anderson booked both Jim Crockett Promotions and Georgia Championship Wrestling simultaneously. Although after Scott left the company, Jim Crockett Promotions went through several bookers including Dory Funk Jr. and Dusty Rhodes. In 1982, Jim Crockett partnered with wrestlers Ric Flair and Blackjack Mulligan to start a secondary company out of Knoxville, Tennessee, Southern Championship Wrestling. The promotion featured such stars as Mulligan, his son Barry Windham, Kevin Sullivan, Wayne Ferris, the Mongolian Stomper, Terry Taylor, and Tim Horner. The enterprise, however, lasted less than 1 year. Greg Valentine returned to Mid-Atlantic in September 1982 and immediately restarted his feud with Wahoo for the U.S. title. Valentine won the title on November 4, 1982 in Norfolk, Virginia, and after a few weeks, Wahoo left the promotion again, but returned in August 1983 to help out former enemy Roddy Piper in his feud with Dick Slater and Greg Valentine. Wahoo then started teaming with Mark Youngblood to go against Dick Slater and Bob Orton Jr. By the 1980s, the U.S. pro wrestling industry was undergoing seismic and rapid change. The old NWA sanctioned system of separate regional territory promotions was collapsing under increasingly competitive pressure from Vincent McMahon's World Wrestling Federation, itself a family-owned territory promotion covering the northeastern United States, which was aggressively expanding into a nationwide promotion. Crockett had similar expansion goals, envisioning a united NWA through Jim Crockett Promotions, buying out or merging with all of its member regional territories. Ted Turner had realized the value of professional wrestling for cable television in the early 1970s. This was a smart move for Turner, as pro wrestling provided his then failing channel to a source of cheap and live entertainment, well suited to the TBS target audience at the time. Turner could run per-inquiry ads and take part of the sales profits just by providing the big viewing audience delivered by pro wrestling's loyal fan base. Turner's superstation TBS had asked Georgia Championship Wrestling, whose television show aired on Saturday nights, to change its public brand name to World Championship Wrestling, helping fuel rumors that the Jim Barnett-controlled company would itself go national. Georgia Championship Wrestling changed its name to World Championship Wrestling in 1982. Meanwhile, by 1983, Jim Crockett Promotions went from recording its weekly shows in a television studio to shooting on location, in between matches at live arena events. After purchasing a mobile television production unit for $1 million, Crockett unveiled what became the NWA's dominant end-of-the-year annual supercard, Starrcade. Starrcade was the first annual professional wrestling event produced under the National Wrestling Alliance banner by Jim Crockett Promotions. The event took place on November 24, 1983 at the Greensboro Coliseum and was broadcast on closed-circuit television around the United States. 8 matches were featured. The main event was a steel cage match where Ric Flair defeated Harley Race to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Their feud began after Race won the title from Flair in June. Race then offered a bounty to have Flair put out a professional wrestling. In August prior to the event, Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Slater attacked Flair, appearing to inflict on him a career-ending injury. Flair announced his retirement, but shortly after, as a result of his victory in the match, Flair was acknowledged as a reputable champion and their feud ended after the event. The event also included a match featuring Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood against Jack and Jerry Briscoe for the NWA World Tag Team Championship, and a dog collar match between Roddy Piper and Greg Valentine. Harley Race had been wrestling for over 20 years and was physically and emotionally exhausted. He took time off from professional wrestling, and his loss at Starrcade is seen as the torch passing to Ric Flair. Flair's win at Starrcade was significant as it made Flair a reputable champion. During an international tour in 1984, without the approval of the NWA Board of Directors, Flair lost the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Race on March 21st in Wellington, New Zealand, and won it back 2 days later in Kallang, Singapore. This was done to increase attendance of the events, and the title changes were not recognized by the NWA until years later. Race never won the title again. On May 6, Kerry Von Erich won the title from Flair as a tribute to Kerry's brother David, who died in February. Flair won the title back 18 days later. At the end of Starrcade, Dusty Rhodes made a challenge to Flair for the title, and this led to their match at the following year's Starrcade. The feud between Carlos Colon and Abdullah the Butcher continued for over a decade, while other feuds ended with their match at Starrcade. According to Dave Meltzer, Dusty Rhodes came up with the name Starrcade and booked the show in later years. Starrcade drew a sold-out attendance of over 15,000 fans, $500,000 at the gate at the Greensboro Coliseum. The attendance at closed-circuit television broadcast locations was affected by a winter storm and only drew around 30,000 fans. Its use at the event popularized closed-circuit television broadcasting for professional wrestling events. Starrcade continued to be the flagship event of the promotion. Crockett promoted cards in association with Maple Leaf Wrestling out of Canada, which was promoted by Frank Tunney until his death in 1983. The Greensboro Coliseum was a major arena for Jim Crockett Promotions, and it had the largest seating capacity, and it was a Sunday night tradition for years in the area. Greensboro got almost all of the major title changes, the Cadillac Cup cards that Crockett ran once a year, almost all of the major house show angles, and had one of the great ring announcers in Tom Miller. Some of the top stars of the 1980s were the Superstar, Blackjack Mulligan, Roddy Piper, Paul Jones, Rocky Johnson, Greg Valentine, Ron Bass, Ivan and Nikita Koloff, and Jimmy Valiant. An extra sense of urgency was added to Crockett's national expansion ambitions when, after Frank Tunney's death, his Toronto promotion joined forces with the WWF. Crockett would now have to find other willing partner promoters or buy them out if he wanted to run shows outside the Mid-Atlantic territory. This period also marked Crockett's first attempt to create a national promotion. Crockett and other wrestling companies needed this opportunity after the WWF buyout of the Toronto territory occurred. As well, after the WWF program The War to Settle the Score aired on MTV to high ratings. Together with Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and Memphis-based Jarrett Promotions, Jim Crockett Promotions created Pro Wrestling USA. However, the organization fell apart in January 1986. Jim Crockett bought out Ole Anderson's Championship Wrestling from Georgia on April 6, 1985, and was re-elected the NWA president. This was to help counter the WWF after it became America's dominant wrestling business in the wake of the first WrestleMania. Crockett then purchased both Saturday evening TBS time slots from Vince McMahon, thus making Crockett the outright owner of World Championship Wrestling. Crockett filled the time slot with 2 hours of original programming filmed in Ted Turner's Atlanta studios. The programming aired under the World Championship Wrestling banner, which had been adopted by GCW before its demise. As a result of the success World Championship Wrestling now had from acquiring the Saturday time slots, Crockett was able to establish the annual summer supercard, the Great American Bash. By 1987, Crockett was elected to a third term as NWA president and gained control of the St. Louis Wrestling Club, Heart of America Sports Attractions, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and Bill Watts Mid-South Sports. Despite Crockett having 6 consolidated territories under his banner and leading the NWA, Jim Crockett Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance were 2 separate entities, and Crockett, like all NWA promoters before him and since, was simply licensing the NWA brand names. This despite the fact that during his reign, Crockett had an ironclad grip on the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. By this point, Jim Crockett Promotions' top contracted performer, Ric Flair, was locked in as champion, even though he was obligated to perform title defense matches in each territory against his own chosen challenger. Any title changes occurred between only other performers also under contract to Jim Crockett. Crockett's rapid expansion had significant financial consequences for the promotion. Jim Crockett Promotions expanded operations and by December had bought out upstart rival the UWF. Crockett even moved many of his administrative employees from the Charlotte base to Watt's former headquarters in Dallas. Jim Crockett Jr. and Dusty Rhodes personally manned the Dallas office, leaving David Crockett in charge of the Charlotte branch. Bob Geigel, former NWA president who bought back his promotion from Crockett in February 1987, had also withdrawn from the NWA. Jim Crockett Promotions began to run shows in new markets from coast to coast, often in less than sold-out arenas, greatly increasing travel costs and other overhead. Jim Crockett Promotions' first pay-per-view endeavor, 1987 Starrcade, was scheduled in its traditional Thanksgiving slot, but ran into unexpected competition from the WWF's inaugural Survivor Series pay-per-view, which was scheduled to air the same night. Not wanting to possibly lose to the WWF in a direct pay-per-view competition, Crockett decided to move Starrcade's starting time to Thanksgiving afternoon, not evening. However, the WWF threatened cable companies that if they chose to air Starrcade at all, the WWF would not offer them any future pay-per-views, including that year's Survivor Series and next year's WrestleMania. At the time, WWF was the uncontested #1 pay-per-view content provider in America, so only a handful of companies committed to Jim Crockett Promotions, devastating Starrcade 87's profitability. A similar incident occurred in January 1988 when the WWF scheduled the first Royal Rumble special on the USA Network to air directly against Jim Crockett Promotions' Bunkhouse Stampede. Once again, the WWF had succeeded in cutting into the buy rates of a Jim Crockett Promotion pay-per-view show. As a result, Crockett aired the first ever Clash of Champions, featuring a pay-per-view quality card on free TV on March 27, 1988 on TBS in an attempt to draw viewers away from WrestleMania 4, which took place the same night. This was one of the few tactics to actually work for Jim Crockett in his war with the World Wrestling Federation, as WrestleMania 4's buy rate was much lower than the prior year's Survivor Series had been. However, Clash of Champions was now the only thing Crockett could use to keep the NWA alive, though it was not even highly watched as WWF's Saturday Night Main Event. On the verge of bankruptcy, Crockett sold Jim Crockett Promotions to Ted Turner in November of 1988, and the promotion was renamed the Universal Wrestling Corporation. Soon after, it was renamed again to World Championship Wrestling. The eventual downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions, leading to its eventual sale to Ted Turner, and thereby the birth of WCW, can be attributed to several key factors. Magnum TA, who was scheduled to become NWA World Heavyweight Champion at Starrcade 86, was severely injured in a car accident 2 months earlier and could never wrestle again. Jim Crockett Promotions turned their major heel Nikita Koloff into a face on October 25th to take Magnum TA's place while still being able to have a profitable build-up to Starrcade's main event. Jim Crockett Promotions alienated loyal fans in the Carolinas by moving Starrcade 87 and the Bunkhouse Stampede to arenas in Chicago and New York respectively. Jim Crockett Promotions had no real history and market presence in either of those non-southern metro areas, and its ability to drawing sellout crowds for arena shows in the southeast eventually suffered, as some local fans vindictively withheld their support. Booking decisions also factored into the promotion's downfall. Jim Crockett Promotions flushed away a potentially profitable angle following the acquisition of Bill Watts' UWF by reportedly burying the UWF's talent. Meanwhile, mid-Carter Ronnie Garvin beat Ric Flair for the NWA World title. Although Garvin was booked to be a babyface, fans did not find Garvin a credible enough challenger to be a serious threat to Ric Flair. Jim Crockett Promotions apparently neglected to monitor its own lavish spending as well. Crockett flew himself and his top performers around in an expensive private jet. In addition to the expenses of Crockett's personal jet, there are other extravagant purchases such as limousines provided for various wrestlers and regular business parties held by officials throughout Jim Crockett Promotions' regional offices. In addition, the large amount of capital needed to take a wrestling federation on a national tour and Crockett's aggressive territorial acquisitions had seriously drained Jim Crockett Promotions' cash flow. Compounding the issues that came with the expansion was a lack of investing in the kind of marketing needed to make it successful. As mentioned, major cards such as Starrcade and the Bunkhouse Stampede did not draw as well when moved out of Jim Crockett Promotions' traditional territory. According to Dusty Rhodes, Jim Crockett Promotions failed to gain the national name recognition that McMahon achieved with the World Wrestling Federation. Rhodes also pointed out that with WWF's success, McMahon was financially able to lure top talent away from rival companies. Because of this, Jim Crockett Promotions offered many of its stars lucrative contracts, paying them beyond their actual value to prevent them from leaving the company. Another factor was the fans' exasperation with the Dusty finish, which was a type of screwjob finish named after Dusty Rhodes, who did not actually invent the concept, but used it frequently for matches at regular house shows and pay-per-view cards alike. Due to the heavy overuse to this uncreative and predictable end-of-match sequence, Mid-Atlantic fans started to expect a swerve at any moment whenever a popular wrestler appeared to win a match and was about to be awarded the championship belt, only to have the win overturned due to a technicality. As a result, attendance to live shows began to fall, even at venues where Jim Crockett Promotions had traditionally drawn well or extremely well. That was the untold story of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling.